All right. So I think without further ado, let's bring Neelu on to start up sessions there. Hey, hey, Neelu. Let's unmute you. Hold on a second there. Neelu, feel free to unmute your mic in there.
Now can you hear me?
Yes. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I don't know if that's just on my side. Eric, do you hear that as well?
Yeah, I'm getting a little feedback.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we hear you, but it's a little bit staticky. The mic sounds distorted a bit for some reason.
Okay, just give me a second.
Sure. Hey, Neelu.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, fantastic. Much better.
Okay, great. So let me share my screen.
Sure. And I think what was happening there is your microphone, no pun intended, intentionally right there, but it was going full throttle, right? It was just overpowered and ready for your next session that you're going to be speaking to us about.
Yeah, I think I had to reset it a little bit, but can you see the screen now?
Yes, we have it. We're ready to go. And if you want to take it away, feel free to go ahead.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks a lot for having me here at DevSecOn. So it all starts a few years ago, actually, and I was just thinking about the entire subject that I wanted to talk about a few years ago when I joined my current organization. Those days were the pre-pandemic days when we used to go around meeting people. So I was pretty excited. I went around talking to the tech leads, tech architects. I wanted to meet the heads of tech and security, and I was trying to understand at that time what is their one main problem statement that they were trying to solve, and that I could help with. And almost unanimously, everybody was talking about just one thing. The main ask was to make security more proactive, given that it was an agile development environment, and they wanted the teams to be enabled to do security on their own. And interestingly, having been from an offensive security background and having done security the typical way for a long time, many of us would sort of dread the idea of letting go, losing that control that many of us as security teams have. And that felt a bit out of place for me as well. But I kept that in mind. I came back and I was thinking of, how do we tackle this particular problem statement that was given. And I kept thinking about it while I was, into automation and doing assessments and other things. So one day I was just talking to someone, and they just sort of threw this statement on me while they were talking, and very casually, they mentioned culture eats strategy for breakfast. And this is a famous quote by Peter Drucker. And at that time, it was new to me. And it just struck me when they said that. And I was thinking about it for quite a while. And then I realized how true that is. So essentially here, what he's trying to say is whether you have strategy and tactics and they have their own importance, if you want to succeed at an organizational scale, culture is something that you need to focus on. So that is what stayed with me. But just for us to understand the rationale behind what we are going to discuss further, I wanted to also show you this other side, which is more logical to the whole thing. Is in the past few years we've been seeing attack trends moving from the network side to the application side, and now the new attack surface is more like cloud, and it has moved to the supply chain, and we are seeing more and more attacks happening in this area. It could be because of changing technology or newer environments, or even the ease of provisioning systems and scaling them these days. But whatever be the reason, when you look at it a little more deeply, for example, if you just pick up the supply chain attacks that have been so prevalent these days, you will see that many or most of these have happened because of either, for example, insecure pipeline components or insecure product, or just unmanaged secrets. And the common denominator in all of this is that we as development teams have left something open or misconfigured or something like that. Now, the other thing that I was thinking about when I was thinking of this is that given that there is a lot of change, there are a lot of variables, there is something else that has changed as well for these kind of attacks to be very, very prevalent now. So, and that's when I thought about Agile. We have been working in the waterfall model for quite a few years, long time back, and most of us or many of us have in the last decade been moving to primarily agile forms of development. Agile, as many of us would know, is iterative and incremental. It's time boxed. But one primary thing about agile development is it is very fast paced. There are faster releases, there are faster deployments happening, and the context is evolving very, very fast. What happened in this last few years was that the speed of development in agile was so fast that operations had to catch up. They had to automate a lot of things, and I would say it worked wonderfully for them. But the idea is, can we equate that with security? Will it equally work for security? So when you look at the products which are available now, there are a lot of products in the market to do product security of sorts. But you can in fact do code reviews, you can do dependency checking, you can do dynamic testing, infrastructure assessments, or even container scanning. There are a lot of things that we can do. However, even in that attack surface, you will see that things like business logic issues, API security, issues around IDORs or session management, a lot of these kind of issues which are not picked up by these products. So I wanted to actually give you a quick idea of the extended attack surface that we are actually dealing with in terms of development. It's a very rough sort of an indicator of what I'm trying to say, but you understand in terms of these are the components in terms of the agile development environment. You will have a developer who has who's pushing in the custom code to source control, and then there are a bunch of libraries that we pull in. We build that and create our container artifacts and essentially push that to production. Now, it's not just these systems. There are many other systems like at the back end, like the data stores or databases that you're dealing with, other public or private repositories from where you're pulling in your images. And these are not just these instances that we are talking about when we say development, particularly in Agile. We are also talking about all of these various actors who could be vulnerable or could be compromised in one way or another. That means the real attack surface is not just any of these components which could be vulnerable. In fact, I think there is a talk on CI fuzzing later today, which you should definitely watch. I will look out for it. Individually, there are a lot of vulnerabilities that we can exploit for these components, but there are also a lot that can be done for the actors themselves who are maybe configuring these systems, setting them up, or writing the code base. That means that there are a lot of other attacks that can happen as well. Like there are supply chain issues, there's social engineering, phishing, endpoint issues. And as you would remember recently, there were a lot of 0 days that sort of gave us a roller coaster ride. So those things are there as well. So that brings us to the other point, which is the other layer which we generally talk about, which is people. And people becomes then the center stage of if you are trying to make any long-term lasting impact in terms of security. When you talk about people in an agile development environment, the main set of folks that you will think of or who should be the centerpiece of your or the target audience that you have would be the development teams, right? So when you're mainly dealing with the developers or development teams, what is it that you're supposed to look at when you're trying to actually drive a mindset change for them? So essentially, first try and understand what are their development challenges. Many times as security teams, we forget to even think about it. They're already being agile. They're working towards faster time to markets. They're working towards performance indicators that they have to meet, usability requirements that they have to meet, and all of that they are doing in tighter delivery timelines. Then before you go to them with a product for automation, it's important to understand what is their current tech context. Like for example, how do they manage their dependencies currently, right? What is working for them? What is their process of PRs? And if you are going to introduce a process change for them, it's also important to see where they are in terms of, for example, awareness to even pick up that process and make the right sense of it, and not just make it a checklist in their entire scheme of things. And hence I
Neelu,
came back.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I just want to give you a heads up that we're getting a lot of that static audio feedback again. So if you can potentially reset, and we'll just pause here for a moment.
Okay.
I know how it can feel, so no worries about the technical difficulties and stuff like that. We'll get through it, and we can adjust timing on things too. Okay.
Cool, no problem.
All right.
So
I'll add
just to
your feedback.
continue where I left, yeah, thanks. When I came back and started looking at, how do you drive that mindset change, it was something that I was looking at more from a people standpoint, and how do we bring about that cultural change. I started designing a security change program that would bring about that change. And the idea and goal for us was to actually have security champions in every team who would sort of catapult security into the projects, and stay close and drive that culture change. Um, so whenever you are in that journey as a security team, when you're trying to design a program yourself, there are some key considerations to look at when you're starting that. So the first thing is, keep the problem statement in mind. Many times there are so many issues that we are dealing with that we get into rabbit holes. So you have to understand what is the problem that you're solving for, and how relevant it is for your target audience. In this case, the development teams, and what kind of outcomes you're looking at. Secondly, look at the stakeholders that you have. It could be the participants, the development teams themselves. It could also be, for example, influencers and projects, right? Who you want to work with to take this further ahead. Also, the leaders in your organization and stuff like that. And finally, also look at basic things like tech stacks. What are the technical constraints? What is the budget you're working with? The timelines that you're working with. Things like, for example, timeline is not just delivery timelines, but also the time that the teams will have to invest in your program once that rolls out. Secondly, when you're creating a program, always keep in mind to make it lean, because you're doing it for an agile development environment. So, for example, in our case, when I started, we had this whole 9-step process to go through to the right outcome, and it did work for us for the initial pilots. But what we did was, soon we came back to brainstorm and make it much leaner from that perspective, so that we could roll it out to larger set of teams, because we were to work with hundreds of teams after that. So we made it very simple 3-step process, on including onboarding, where we would focus on awareness, workshops where we would focus on more practical high intensity tasks which we would enable the sec champs for, and followed by governance. When you're defining any process changes that you want them to pick up, the teams to pick up for your program, it's very essential when doing that for an agile environment, is to align with the key agile rituals. That way is what happens is, it ensures that it becomes a practice for them, and that it becomes more like muscle memory, right, when they're doing development. So in our case, when we had threat modeling like at the heart of what we were trying to enable them for. And for example, for iterations, right, we would have a sprint plan or an initial iteration planning meeting. So when that ritual happens, we made sure that we are looking at, the teams are picking up the features right at that time, for which feature would be threat modeled in that iteration. Secondly, rotate and iterate. So it's important to have frequent but smaller threat modelings in this parlance, is to do it more frequently but in small sizes. So for example, rather than doing an entire threat modeling for an entire application, we would rather focus on smaller threat modeling on features, but do it more frequently. Thirdly, make it official. Whatever threats that came out of our threat modelings are supposed to go to the project dashboard. So, for example, your Jira or your Confluence, you can add it to that directly. Secure your source. So it's good to start with secure defaults. Create, for example, secure baseline images, or hardened configuration, or a safer code base to start off with. Totally depends on the program that you are going for. In our case, for example, we had, in terms of threat modeling, because that was at the core of this program, we were focusing on giving them an initial set of scenarios that they could look in the context of, which were generally the commonly occurring scenarios for our teams. And lastly, leverage the pipeline. So I think this has been discussed a lot and tremendously in DevSecOps. So I will not speak too much about it. It's important. It's a very special place in development where you can add and automate a lot of stuff. So leverage that, but ensure that you have the right kind of KPI set for it. For example, when does it really break the build? Or do you have the SLAs to go ahead and fix the high critical issues that you have found in that particular run? So before going in with it, we had the onboarding process where we're looking at awareness. But some important things to do when you're going for developer awareness is, apart from the general awareness that you're looking at, it's also important to look at role specific trainings, in the sense that what can they do in their respective roles. So we know that a developer can code securely. A BA, they will be gathering requirements, right? So they should be explicitly asking for security requirements as well, and they should be adding that as acceptance criteria in their stories as well. So those are the kind of things that you want to tell them and how to do that, so that the security is everyone's responsibility actually becomes true. um, Secondly, there are many times that we create a lot of these baselines and checklists and even images and stuff that I was talking about, but many times developers may not have awareness around that. So do they know where it is? Can they just pick up and run with it when they are starting off their projects? Is something you should ask yourself. And lastly, look at a format of awareness where they can stay updated. There are so many new attacks coming up every day. Are they updated about these recent patches? Any recent issues that affect their systems? So things like that should be discussed very, very frequently. And one efficient way of doing that, we figured, was to create and nurture a community of all of these people. So we created a community of SecChamps where everyone, especially SecChamps and the development teams, could actually interact around more hands-on fixes and talking to each other about these daily issues, which they could then pick up and discuss with each other and resolve. In our case,
Neelu, I'm so sorry to interrupt again. I don't mean to keep doing this to you, but that static keeps creeping back in somehow for some reason.
for us, we were looking at, so in terms of awareness, we were looking at agile threat modeling, and what we were particularly trying to do is, apart from the academic side of it, apart from understanding how to do strike-based threat modeling quickly, we were looking at how to operationalize this better. We were looking at essentially telling them how you can time it better rather than running into rabbit holes. We were trying to tell them or teaching them around getting together and adding their perspective when they're doing threat modeling. How do they prioritize issues? So once you have the threats out, how do you prioritize the issues and add them to your project dashboard? How do you turn them into either acceptance criteria or stories, or tasks for that matter, and then add them to the project dashboard? So these were the practical aspects that we wanted to focus on, something that they could pick up, would be more hands-on for them, and they could pick up and do it in a more agile fashion. For communication, one important thing to understand is try and leverage as many channels of communication as possible. Emails, chat channels, create channels if there are not any. But in an agile development environment, what I have seen works best is the face-to-face communication, and that I think stays for a very long period of time. In the past couple of years, that has become really difficult. But even when wherever you can interact with smaller groups, or pair with developer teams rather than just remotely or working in silos and just sending an email and forgetting about it. One thing to keep in mind as a security team is to change our own mindset before we go to the developers asking them to change the mindset. So in this case, focus on people interactions rather than set standards that you may have. Remember that to make the function secure, you will have to make security functional. So always go with a working solution. Third, very important, is to collaborate with the teams as much as possible. Sit down, pair with developers or pair with DevOps and all of these individual roles and understand what their challenges are. And lastly, adapt to changes in technology. Right, technology for development teams is actually changing really fast. So we should adapt to technology as much as possible. How do you engage the developers, which in our case we were mostly looking at sectams and their engagement. One thing that I would like to share is, rather than, whenever we go to the team, sometimes we make that mistake of throwing in security words or keywords or jargons, like for example, rather than telling them zero trust on the first day, it's always good to start off with discussing more concrete and actionable tasks, or items that they can take up maybe before their next stand up, something like that. Secondly, keep them motivated as much as possible, and aware of the recent issues. One great way of motivating these set of folks is to let them own their journey, right? Let them own the changes that they want to make in their projects, be it automation, be it around adding some other controls in process changes and stuff like that. Once you have told them what the goal is, let them own that. And lastly, you can also gamify the experience, right? So across your organization or delivery organization, if you're looking at engaging these people or all the development teams way more, it's always good to gamify that. How can you do that? Maybe you might have heard of the systems of badges or levels, different levels in security. So it's always good to create something like that where they can move from one badge to another and always look forward to something new. So that sort of brings in a healthy competition as well for them. So rather than giving them a one-time solution, it's rather good to teach them how to fish. That's the idea. So all of this works well in a smaller scale, and it worked well for our pilots also. But when you move on to address this at scale, like with, in our case, it was hundreds of teams that we were going to roll it out. Uh, I have some more learnings to share. First thing is simplify the goals as much as possible so that everyone, including a developer or a leader, understands it equally well and everyone is on the same page. That way it becomes very easy to interpret solutions that you are recommending as well. Um, Atomic success is very important before you get success at scale, which means that for if you're introducing a process or practice, always try and test it on some of the teams. It has to succeed in a unit scale. So whether you're looking at unit being your project or it being your squad or streams, it should succeed there and work well there for it to function well at scale. Thirdly, having a set of secure defaults really helps. So whatever be your program that you're building it around, it's good to have a set of secure defaults to start off with. Now, what it really helps with is to give that a quick win to the developers also. And once they have that quick win, it's like a win-win situation where they can start psychologically at a stronger place and then they stick for a longer time to the changes that you might have recommended through your program. The other thing that is important while doing that is remember what you are in for. So you are trying to drive a mindset change, and it's very important to build a mindset for edge cases. So essentially, take them through the entire journey that you will have as a security person, right? If you were playing all of these roles, you would ask yourself questions or try to answer some of those security questions. Are they asking those questions? Do they have a critical mindset while they are playing their role within the development team? So that is something to look for. Leverage automation wherever possible. Once they start identifying threats early on in the life cycle, they will start seeing more uh, things or issues that can be predicted early on and or are recurring and can be automated. So for example, if there is a solution to add stages, right, to a certain type of pipeline, and you're dealing with multiple different kind of CIs in your environment, then what's created for one can be reused for another, always depending on how many different teams are using that. So leverage that as much as possible. When you're introducing processes or practices, it's important that they're effective. So the first thing to ensure that is that you align with your agile development lifecycle, the delivery timelines, the lifecycle, and the rituals, like I was talking about. And when you're adding practices, ensure that they're effective and they're driving a behavior change. So if you have an option of two processes or two different ways of doing something similar, it's always good to bank on the one that will drive the behavior change in the long run. And lastly, communicate the why. I think this is something that I cannot emphasize enough. I realized this only when we, started addressing this issue at scale, and then we started working with hundreds of sectrams. the initial part of clearing the why becomes or helps you way longer in the program or until much later, so for us this is an ongoing program, and once this why part is clear for all of them, all the stakeholders, there are much lesser questions and there are way more solutions. So the overall attitude of your target audience will definitely improve and become way more positive if you have clarified the why for them. So some of the results from what we had done earlier for this, we started with a pilot, a bunch of teams, and then we started doubling up on how many teams we wanted to roll this out to. Some of the early wins for us were essentially discovering hundreds of threads. We soon started discovering hundreds of threads alongside the SecChamps and the development teams, and also fixing the high critical issues from there. SecChamps soon became the point of contact for security, and everybody started reaching out to them internally and externally for anything to do with security. So now everybody become way more proactive. And one of the things that definitely changed for us, which was not the goal of the program, but was quite interesting, is that the entire push model that security generally struggles with became a pull model. So initially, we would reach out to teams for them to enroll for the SecChamp program. And as of today, all the new teams that are coming up, they reach out to us directly to enroll for the program themselves, or even for that matter, for doing a threat modeling. So they would loop us in when they're doing a threat modeling, or let us know that how many issues they have and what are they prioritizing. So that makes the job of, if you have been a security team, that makes your job much easier than working in a push model. So, in an ideal setup, how the people will play a role in the development would be something like this, where you are going through, ensure that the development teams are going through their role specific awareness, but also the tech stack specific trainings, because before you start development, you generally know what is the kind of tech stack that you're going to work with. When you're in the design phase, leverage threat modeling to identify threats early on, but not in silos, or not only with a security expert, but the entire team should be involved along with your SecChamps if you have any. Once you have your security backlog created, ensure that all of these security acceptance criteria or stories or features that you may have discussed are moving to the project dashboard, and you allocate the developer a dev pair or a bandwidth for that to address that issue. Once you start development, definitely leverage automation for everything, including SAST or DAST or your container scanning and things like that. But towards the end of it, take time to have sort of a retro, like reflect upon or inspect upon what are the issues that you got from the threat modeling that you did, or from the automated runs, or even, for example, if you're doing an external vendor assessment, what are the kind of issues you're getting, how many of those are really recurring, which can be coded, right, or can be coded into security unit tests, for example, or can be addressed through design or through acceptance criteria in your future stories. So for a mature security team, it will mostly look like this, where they are. It's much easier for them to get into security huddles, like huddles in the sense you can just pick up a feature and start looking at doing a quick threat modeling, or checking the workflow for security threats. Iterative threat modeling become a common thing. When you're defining the acceptance criteria for your stories, it should show the security validations essentially should be showing in those stories as well, which can be tested later by a QA. Of course, leverage automation as much as possible, and add security to the definition of done. Right? So a story is essentially not done until it's security done. Finally, focus on the process and pipeline to ensure that you can gain velocity and ensure coverage when you're trying your change program. Understand that the ecosystem should be secure by design rather than the individual components in your supply chain. And lastly, leverage culture to add security to your organizational fabric. So there'll be many things that you might do to bring in smaller changes, add controls in place, have automation in place from time to time. But if we are driving the mindset change, it's better to play the long game. Thank you.
That was excellent, Neelu, and a round of applause for dealing with all the technical issues too there. You handled
Sorry
it
for
very
that.
smoothly, so I know
Always fun
how
to do it live.
yes. I know how jarring that can be, and you handled it so professionally, Neelu. So well done on that, and thank you for that excellent session. So I think do you have a few more minutes here? We have a couple questions for you, if you don't mind. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Okay, great. All right. So first question that came up was, I believe it was Kavitha over in Hopin. Thank you, Kavitha, for the question. And their question was, what tools were used in the process journey? Or were there any in particular that you could call out and share with folks that enabled some of what you learned and shared through this process?
So for us, when we were driving the SecChamp program particularly, so we have other automation specific programs where we have tools which we recommend, for adding controls. Because this was mostly a people focused program and we were looking at agile threat modelings. That is a framework that we have sort of created in within ThoughtWorks, and that's what we used. Particularly for agile threat modeling, it's based on top of Microsoft Stride model itself, but a faster and much quicker way of doing it. We did not use specifically any tools. There are tools for threat modeling as well, but given that our organization is more like a service based organization, there are multiple clients and different tech stacks, different compliance requirements. The context is entirely different for all the clients. So we kept it simple and we kept it agile.
Excellent, excellent. The one thing that hit home for me, and we have a couple more questions, but really quick, one thing that hit home for me was when you talked about security as part of your definition of done. You like, it really brought me back to recalling some of my earlier developer days where we as a team were defining this definition of done, and we didn't have security included in there, honestly speaking, but we had things like testing and what like deploying it in a staging environment to make sure it works there. And so yeah, thank you for sharing that part in there. And I'm thinking back, how did we not think about, okay, how do we include security in that definition of done too? So it's just awesome to see. And I think this is gonna be super helpful to the older me as well. And folks that were there. So one more question I think we'll take real quick. And that is, were there were separate projects created for cloud and on-premise applications throughout this? Potentially?
Um, we were essentially working on a security change program, and we were not delivering any projects. However, we were dealing with, if I understand your question correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, we were dealing with various projects. Some of them were on cloud, some of them were on prem, and in fact some of them were also purely infrastructure projects, right? So the agile threat modeling, or for example for us it was threat modeling, we were working on. We When we talk to about threat modeling, it would be different for example specifically for applications or just web applications or mobile applications, right? Because you look at different issues which are commonly found in mobile rather than web. So web would be different, mobile would be different, infrastructure would be different, because then you might actually do an infrastructure threat modeling and also architecture review from that perspective. So this context was different for us, and with cloud we would definitely have or look into different scenarios for cloud. So that was the degree of difference that we were following. Within that also there were many subdivisions, but we didn't go that far. We wanted to keep it simple so that everybody could pick up and understand. For example, if you are looking at mobile, then you should go for also mobile top 10 issues rather than just blindly looking at the web top 10. So just giving an example from OWASP, there are very contextual issues to look at, and that's what we were focusing on during our threat modeling.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. And thank you everybody that was posting some of the questions in there. Eric, do we have any more questions maybe that are coming to mind for you, or?
Yeah, well, Simon asked one. I was trying to find it in our list. I'm just going to ask it from the chat.
Okay.
It says, when you say iterative threat modeling, what triggers an update to the threat model that was created before? Would bug fixes or minor improvements count?
Yeah, oh, that's a good question. So when we say iterative threat modeling, it is to pick up a bunch of features, right? So when you start developing your services, you would have certain features being added with every release. Generally, it will not all happen at one go, like it happens in waterfall. So when you have a bunch of features which are being added with in every iteration, or every couple of iteration, you will have a bunch of new features coming up. We would pick up a bunch of features and then start whiteboarding and threat modeling around it, and that is what we called iterative, because it would be every one or two iterations we would have a threat modeling, because we would have new set of features that we would threat model on.
That's great. Great way to keep things fresh as the application changes. One of the things
But
that actually I'm going to steal this. I'm going to quote you on this one. I loved when you said that you need to hopefully I won't butcher this. To make the functionality secure, you need to make security functional. That is like a genius quote, and I love that. Thank you so much.
yeah, you realize so much of that once you are on the agile side of things, that just to add to the previous answer, I think, just to clarify it further, if you've already done a threat modeling for your entire application or your entire service, for example, and you are then making a change, whether it's a bug fix or it's an update, you will have to look at functionally what you have really added. Sometimes minor enhancements we should not go to that depth, because then that makes it too much to a micro level, and you may not end up getting too many threats. So when you're looking at the ROI, because you're also counting time of how many times you're getting into a threat modeling, it's good to see what is, if it's a major change that you have done, a major update that you have done, if you have something majorly functional that has been added or changed, to go about doing another threat modeling for that change.
Very cool.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Neelu, so much. This was super insightful, and you did an amazing job. We appreciate you helping us kick off the Americas region for DevSecCon, and we'll hope to see you again soon. We'll see you in the chat, maybe over on Hopin and YouTube.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.